July 13, 1943. Rastenburg, East Prussia. The Wolfsschanze. Adolf Hitler's headquarters occupied a complex of bunkers and wooden structures deep in the Masurian woods. At 1,400 hours, two of Germany's most senior field commanders arrived by separate flights from the Eastern Front. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein commanded Army Group South. Field Marshal Günther von Kluge commanded Army Group Center. They had been summoned with minimal notice. Neither man knew precisely why, though both understood the conference would address Operation Citadel, the offensive that had consumed German armored strength for 8 days. The meeting room held maps of two theaters. One showed the Kursk salient, where 780,000 German troops had been attempting since July 5th to pinch off Soviet forces in a massive double envelopment. The second map displayed Sicily, where 130,000 Allied troops had landed 3 days earlier, on July 10th, overwhelming Italian coastal defenses and threatening the entire Mediterranean position. Hitler opened the conference by stating facts that required no elaboration. The Western Allies had established themselves on Sicily. Italian resistance had collapsed with extraordinary speed. 200,000 Italian soldiers had ceased fighting within 72 hours. The defense rested entirely on 2 German divisions, units already committed and incapable of holding the island without substantial reinforcement. The situation demanded immediate redeployment of forces from the Eastern Front to the Mediterranean theater. Von Kluge received this announcement with visible relief. His Ninth Army, forming the northern pincer of the Kursk offensive, had stalled after penetrating barely 12 kilometers into Soviet defensive belts. Worse, on July 12th, Soviet forces had launched Operation Kutuzov, a massive counteroffensive against the Ural salient threatening the flank and rear of his positions. He had already begun withdrawing Panzer divisions from the Kursk attack to address this new crisis. Hitler's directive to halt Citadel formalized what von Kluge already recognized as operational necessity. Von Manstein objected. His 4th Panzer Army, comprising the southern pincer, had advanced 35 kilometers and fought through extensive Soviet fortifications. At Prokhorovka on July 12th, his 2 SS Panzer Corps had engaged the Soviet 5th Guards Tank Army in the largest armored clash of the war. The tactical outcome remained disputed, but Manstein assessed his forces as positioned to continue the attack. He possessed reserve formations, including the Ziv Panzer Corps, not yet committed to battle. Soviet defensive positions showed signs of exhaustion. Mobile warfare remained possible if the offensive continued. The Field Marshal presented his assessment through operational logic rather than emotional appeal. German forces had inflicted substantial casualties on Soviet defenders. Intelligence estimated Soviet tank losses at 4 times German losses. The 5th Guards Tank Army, though still functioning, had sustained damage requiring weeks to repair. If 4th Panzer Army received permission to continue operations for another week, Manstein argued, it could destroy the Soviet armored reserves concentrated in the southern portion of the salient, potentially forestalling Red Army offensive capacity for the remainder of summer 1943. Hitler's response incorporated strategic considerations that transcended the immediate tactical situation. Operation Citadel had been conceived in March as a rapid offensive to be executed immediately after the spring Rasputitsa ended. Delays for tank production had postponed the attack from May to June, then to July. Each postponement had allowed Soviet forces additional weeks to fortify defensive positions. By July 5th, When the offensive finally launched, Soviet intelligence possessed detailed knowledge of German intentions, troop concentrations, and attack schedules through multiple sources, including the Lucy spy ring and decrypted Wehrmacht communications. The 8 days of combat had demonstrated that surprise, the essential prerequisite for German operational success, no longer existed. Soviet defenders had prepared defensive belts extending 175 kilometers in depth. They had laid more than 400,000 mines. They had constructed 5,000 kilometers of trenches. German forces advancing into this prepared defensive system suffered casualties that could not be replaced. The Wehrmacht in summer 1943 operated under personnel constraints fundamentally different from 1941. Units across all theaters were 470,000 men under strength. Infantry and artillery replacements arrived in insufficient numbers to maintain combat strength. The Führer acknowledged Manstein's tactical assessment, but imposed strategic override. The Sicily landings created immediate requirements that superseded Eastern Front operations. The Italian military had proven incapable of defending Italian territory. The collapse of Mussolini's regime appeared probable within weeks. If Italy exited the war, Germany would face the necessity of occupying the entire Italian peninsula, the Balkans, and southern France with forces that did not exist unless withdrawn from other theaters. Hitler specified the forces required for Mediterranean deployment. The 2 SS Panzer Corps, consisting of 3 elite divisions, Leibstandard SS Adolf Hitler, Das Reich, and Totenkopf, would redeploy to Italy immediately. These divisions represented the most capable armored formations in Army Group South. The units Manstein had positioned to exploit any breakthrough at Kursk. Their removal from the Eastern Front eliminated the operational reserve necessary for continued offensive action. Von Manstein requested a compromise. Allow 4th Panzer Army to continue limited operations for 72 to 96 hours to destroy the identified Soviet tank concentrations, then execute the redeployment. This would prevent the Red Army from immediately transitioning to offensive operations and would justify the casualties already sustained. The resources committed to Citadel, 2,700 tanks, 2,000 aircraft, 10,000 artillery pieces, represented industrial production that Germany could not quickly replace. Halting the offensive without achieving substantive results would render those losses strategically meaningless. Hitler rejected the request. The decision to halt Citadel was not subject to modification or delay. The 2 SS Panzer Corps would begin withdrawing on July 14th. All offensive operations in the Kursk salient would cease. Forces not required for Mediterranean redeployment would transition to defensive positions. The Eastern Front would adopt a strategic defensive posture for the remainder of 1943. The conference concluded at 1,630 hours. Von Manstein departed Rassenburg convinced that operational victory had been possible if political considerations had not intervened. He would later write that the decision represented the final moment when Germany possessed the capability to seize initiative on the Eastern Front. Von Kluge departed with orders consistent with the reality his Ninth Army already confronted. The Soviet counteroffensive against Orel required immediate attention. Citadel had become irrelevant to his sector before Hitler issued the cancellation directive. The orders transmitted from Rassenburg on July 13th traveled through Wehrmacht communication networks to Army Group headquarters, then to Corps and division commanders. By evening of July 14th, German forces across the Kursk salient had received instructions to disengage. The two SS Panzer Corps began withdrawing toward Belgorod. The 4th Panzer Army established defensive positions along lines it had captured during the previous week's advance. 9th Army accelerated its redeployment to address Operation Kutuzov. Soviet forces did not immediately recognize the operational shift. Red Army commanders observed reduced German attack intensity on July 14th and 15th, but interpreted this as tactical regrouping rather than strategic withdrawal. Only when German units abandoned recently captured ground without contest did Soviet intelligence conclude that Citadel had been canceled. This recognition triggered immediate offensive planning. The Red Army possessed fresh reserves, including the entire steppe front under General Ivan Konyev, positioned east of Kursk and held back during the defensive battle. These forces could now transition to offensive operations without concern for German breakthrough. On July 17th, Soviet forces launched the Donbass Strategic Offensive Operation across the Meuse and Donets rivers, striking the southern wing of Army Group South. The operation targeted precisely the sector from which Hitler had withdrawn the Ziv Panzer Corps for potential Kursk commitment, then redirected to Italy. Without this corps to provide mobile reserves, German defensive positions lacked the armored strength necessary to contain major Soviet breakthroughs. By August 3rd, the Red Army had shattered German positions at multiple points. Belgorod fell on August 5th. Kharkov, retaken by Germany in March during von Manstein's successful counteroffensive, was evacuated on August 22nd and occupied by Soviet forces on August 23rd. The German retreat continued through September. By mid-September 1943, the Wehrmacht had withdrawn approximately 150 miles along a 650-mile front. Casualties from July through October exceeded 350,000 men, higher than losses at Stalingrad, where 209,000 had been lost. These figures represented irreplaceable losses, dead, missing, and seriously wounded requiring extended recovery. The Eastern Front consumed German strength at rates that industrial production and manpower mobilization could not sustain. In Sicily, the forces Hitler had prioritized received reinforcement, but insufficient to alter strategic outcome. The 29th Panzer Grenadier Division deployed to the island on July 14th. Additional units followed in subsequent weeks. Yet by August 17th, Allied forces had secured the entire island. German and Italian forces evacuated across the Strait of Messina, losing most heavy equipment. The Mediterranean theater, which Hitler had identified as requiring immediate attention, absorbed German divisions without producing the defensive stability the redeployments were meant to achieve. The decision made at Rastenburg on July 13th operated within constraints that permitted no satisfactory resolution. Continuing Citadel risked the loss of Italy and potential Allied advances into the Balkans, threatening Romanian oil fields essential to German mechanized warfare. Halting Citadel guaranteed that Germany would never again possess the armored strength to execute major offensive operations in the East. Hitler chose to address the immediate Mediterranean crisis at the cost of permanently ceding initiative to the Soviet Union. Field Marshal von Manstein would spend subsequent decades arguing that the decision represented a failure of strategic vision. His post-war memoir, Lost Victories, claimed that 4th Panzer Army stood on the verge of breakthrough when Hitler intervened, and that continued operations would have destroyed Soviet armored reserves. Soviet archival materials released after 1991 challenged this assessment. The Red Army possessed substantially larger reserves than German intelligence estimated. The 5th Guards Tank Army, though damaged at Prokhorovka, could be reconstituted. The steppe front alone contained resources equivalent to German forces committed to the entire Kursk offensive. Modern military historians generally conclude that von Manstein's assessment reflected post-war recrimination rather than accurate operational analysis. The Germans had lost strategic initiative at Kursk not on July 13th when Hitler canceled the offensive, but months earlier when Hitler delayed the operation to await production of Panther and Tiger tanks in quantities that German industry never achieved. Every week of delay allowed Soviet forces to strengthen defensive preparations. By July 5th, when Citadel finally launched, the operation confronted a defensive system too extensive to penetrate with available forces. Hitler's order halting Citadel did not cause German defeat at Kursk. It formalized recognition of defeat that had become apparent through 8 days of combat. The Wehrmacht lacked the strength to achieve the double envelopment Citadel envisioned. Model's 9th Army could not advance more than 12 kilometers. Halts' 4th Panzer Army penetrated 35 kilometers, but faced Soviet defensive belts extending another 140 kilometers. The forces required to complete the encirclement did not exist, and the Soviet counteroffensives launched on July 12th demonstrated that the Red Army retained offensive capacity despite defensive casualties. The order transmitted from Rastenburg on July 13, 1943, ended Germany's ability to conduct strategic offensive operations on the Eastern Front. Every subsequent German action in the East would be reactive, responding to Soviet initiatives, attempting to hold positions, executing tactical counterattacks to delay rather than reverse Soviet advances. The initiative passed to the Red Army and would not return. This was not a decision made in ignorance of consequences. Hitler understood that halting Citadel meant accepting permanent strategic defensive in the East. Von Manstein understood that Mediterranean deployments would not halt Allied advances in Italy. Von Kluge understood that his forces faced Soviet offensives regardless of Citadel status. All three men recognized that Germany's strategic position had deteriorated to the point where no decision could produce favorable outcomes. The question was not whether Germany could win the war, but which theater would receive priority for forces insufficient to defend all fronts simultaneously. The choice to prioritize the Mediterranean over the East reflected Hitler's assessment that the political consequences of Italian collapse outweighed the military consequences of lost initiative in Russia. Italy's exit from the war would expose Germany's southern flank, require occupation of Italian territory, and potentially trigger similar defections among other German allies, Hungary, Romania, Finland. The Eastern Front could be held through defensive operations. The Mediterranean could not be stabilized without active reinforcement. Events would demonstrate that both theaters deteriorated regardless of force allocation. Italy surrendered on September 8, 1943, requiring Germany to occupy the entire peninsula with forces that could have been employed on the Eastern Front. The Eastern Front collapsed into sequential Soviet offensives that drove German forces westward throughout the remainder of 1943 and all of 1944. The Mediterranean deployments delayed, but did not prevent Allied advances. The Eastern Front delays purchased time measured in weeks rather than months. The command issued on July 13, 1943, locked the outcome of Operation Citadel into permanent failure. More significantly, it locked the outcome of the Eastern Front campaign into inevitable German defeat. The Wehrmacht would continue fighting for 22 more months. It would inflict casualties on Soviet forces at ratios that, in earlier wars, would have forced negotiated settlements. But the fundamental balance of forces had shifted irreversibly. The Red Army possessed superior numbers, superior industrial production, and the strategic initiative. Germany possessed tactical competence, defensive positions, and diminishing resources. No single decision determines the outcome of a war fought across multiple continents by millions of combatants over 6 years. But certain decisions crystallize the inevitable. They represent the moment when all alternatives have been exhausted and only one course remains, regardless of its consequences. Hitler's order on July 13, 1943, was such a decision. It did not cause Germany's defeat. It acknowledged defeat as the only remaining trajectory and chose which defeats to accept first. The war documented its own history through orders that could not be rescinded and consequences that could not be avoided. Operation Citadel was planned to restore German initiative. It ended by confirming the initiative's permanent loss. This story represents documented history, not dramatization. The participants did not know the future. They made decisions within the constraints available to them. Those decisions shaped outcomes that became inevitable only in retrospect. If these accounts help you understand how command decisions operate under wartime constraints, you're seeing history as it actually functioned. Not as narrative, but as documented institutional process locked into motion by orders that, once given, cannot be taken back.